As time passes and the world moves on, things get left behind. Some of those things are small and insignificant, like old sofas left on the side of the road. In other cases, they're enormous and significant. Sometimes even whole towns or cities can be left behind. The world is full of these strange, forgotten landmarks, and if they could speak, they'd all have stories to tell. Unfortunately, they can't talk, but we can do their talking for them. We know the stories of these amazing abandoned places and objects, and here they are. There's nothing quite so British as an old red telephone box. Years ago, you used to see them on almost every corner of the country's busiest towns and cities, but there isn't much call for them anymore. Everybody has a mobile phone now, so these iconic structures are being torn down and taken away in their thousands. During the early 1990s, there were more than 120,000 of them in service. Now, less than a tenth of them remain. Some have been scrapped, but you'll find the majority of them at telephone box graveyards like this one on the outskirts of London, England's capital city. Although they've been dragged here, there doesn't appear to be a plan in terms of what's likely to happen to them next. They've spent years exposed to the elements, and their familiar red paint is flaking away to reveal rusty steel underneath. Perhaps somebody has decided that they don't even have scrap value anymore. Almost a century of telecommunications history can be observed here by looking at the changes from one generation of phone boxes to the next, but nobody ever comes to study them, and nobody will make or take a phone call inside any of them ever again. For much of the 20th century, Bulgaria was part of the Soviet bloc, which means it was a communist state. That's no longer the case today, but relics of that time still exist all over the European country. The most well-known and iconic of them is the Bozludza Monument in Kazanlak. Communist architecture can sometimes be brutalist and drab, but you can't say that about this striking monument, which was opened as the headquarters of the country's Communist Party in 1974. In fact, if we didn't know better, we'd say that the people who designed it were inspired by a flying saucer. There's a long history of communist activity at the site of the monument, dating back before the time of the Soviet Union to 1891, when Dimitar Blagov stood on this hill and outlined his visions of a communist future for Bulgaria. Before the building was abandoned, it used to have an enormous stained red glass window shaped like a star as a sign of the country's affiliation with the USSR. That window was one of the first things to be smashed in 1989 when the communist era in Bulgaria came to an end, and the Bozludza Monument was attacked and looted. You might struggle to imagine it from looking at these pictures, but Weizensee Children's Hospital in Berlin, Germany was once one of the most advanced medical facilities in the country. It dates back to Germany's imperial era and was opened in 1911 as Prussia's first municipal hospital, tasked with bringing down the region's worrying infant and child mortality rates. The hospital had its own park and dairy farm, providing milk for the children and mothers inside its walls. The building and its grounds survived both world wars of the 20th century and was still being expanded as recently as 1987, when a new wing was opened. Just 10 years later, following German reunification, it was declared obsolete and shut down. It appeared to have been rescued in 2005 when a Russian investor bought it and promised to reopen it as a new experimental clinic. But the Russians' claims of being able to cure serious diseases using radio waves turned out to be bogus, and then he disappeared, leaving the status of the building and its ownership unclear. While the city's authorities debate what to do with it, it continues to rot and fall apart. Britain was victorious in the Second World War, but the long fight took a heavy toll on the country, and the scars of that time can be seen all over the landscape, especially in coastal regions, where old fortresses and outposts slowly crumble and fall into the sea. Photographer Mark Wilson has made it his mission in life to capture images of these forgotten facilities before they disappear from view forever. One of the most poignant photos he's ever taken is of Studland Harbor in Dorset, where a full-scale combat rehearsal for Operation Neptune was carried out in 1944. Operation Neptune was the name given to the Allied landing on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, 6 of June 1944, resulting in a victory and marking the beginning of the end of the conflict. This lonely pillbox is all that remains of the facilities that once stood here, and by the look of it, it won't last much longer. It's tilted toward the sea and will one day give up the fight against gravity and fall in. As memories of the war disappear from our collective consciousness, so too do some of the places that once played a role in it. We're returning to Berlin in Germany now, where we find the unique building known as the Bierpinsel. It looks more like a work of modern art than a building, and you'd never know that it was abandoned by looking at it from the outside. In truth, the fact that it's been allowed to become abandoned is something of a disgrace. If you had a one-of-a-kind building like this in your hometown, you'd like to think that somebody would be able to find a use for it. The Bierpinsel's name translates into English as the beer brush, and it was built in 1976 by Ralph and Ursula Schuler, a married couple who were both architects. They originally wanted to create a building that resembled a tree, but even they admit that the design got away from them a little bit. For most of its life, it contained a restaurant and a nightclub, but ownership of both facilities has changed hands numerous times throughout the years, seemingly without anybody being able to find a way of making money out of them. Its last reopening was in 2010, when it was given a pop art makeover by street artists and marketed as a place for creatives. Sadly, that plan failed within a year, and it's been empty ever since. Elsewhere in Berlin is the beautiful Wasserturm Prenzlauer Berg, which still manages to retain its splendor despite being abandoned. Underneath its good looks, though, hides a dark history. In the past, it's been a water tower and an apartment complex, but during the Second World War, it was used as a concentration camp by the Nazis. The history of this building dates back to 1877, which makes it the oldest water tower in the whole city. It was an innovative project for its era. Water was stored at the top of the tower, and in the space below it were apartments where the workers responsible for keeping the tower running lived. It briefly went back into use as a water tower after the war, and continued in that role until 1952. By that time, it had become such a local icon that it was incorporated into Berlin's coat of arms. Some of the buildings around it that were used to hold political prisoners during the war were torn down in the years that followed, but the stain of those atrocities still clings to the tower. Perhaps that's why it's been allowed to fall into disuse. Our next stop on this abandonment tour takes us across Europe to France and the bizarre spectacle of La Maison Sculptée in Amanli. Reality seems to stop at the borders of this place, which comes across as something between a fairy tale castle and a fantasy theme park. All of the unique art you'll find here is the work of Jacques Lucas, who bought a row of abandoned houses with his wife Marie-France in 1968, and then partially demolished the old homes, leaving a few walls standing and covering them in paintings before adding sculptures in their gardens. He carried on working at La Maison Sculptée until the mid-1980s, but by the 1990s it was up for auction. Local people banded together to save it from the threat of demolition, and a small team of volunteers still tends to it and maintains it to this very day. Nature has been allowed to grow in and around the buildings, adding to the sense of decay, but that's all part of its unique appeal. There might not be any people here, but we'd never describe it as lifeless. The quiet, dark old building that stands in silence in Beacon, New York, USA, has been known by many names over the years. Ostensibly, it's a Victorian mansion, built for General Joseph Howland in 1859, back when it was known as Tyranda. Years after the general moved out in 1915, it became the first privately licensed psychiatric hospital in the United States of America. Many people believe the old mansion to be cursed. Under its new guise as a treatment facility, Tyranda was renamed Craig House and was run by Clarence Slocum, a Scottish doctor who had some bold new ideas about mental health care and treatment. He believed that most psychiatric conditions could be cured by talking, fine dining, and golf. Unsurprisingly, that didn't work. Notable people who lost their lives to suicide here include Jane Fonda's mother, Frances Seymour, and it was also the place that Rosemary Kennedy was hidden away from the world following her botched lobotomy in 1941. The hospital closed its doors in 1999, although few of the things inside it were removed at the time of its closure, and it has the appearance of being occupied today. New York's subway system runs on for miles and has been revised and upgraded many times over the long history of its existence. Sometimes, when those revisions are made, stations are deemed obsolete and closed down. That was the fate of the 18th Street subway station in Manhattan. It was one of the busier stations in the area in the years following its opening in 1904, but its restricted size meant that it could only cope with 5-car trains. That wasn't enough to cope with demand by the 1940s. So when 23rd Street Station was expanded in the 1940s, 18th Street was no longer required. It welcomed its final passengers in 1948. Millions of New Yorkers still see it every day, though. Trains might no longer stop there, but the 6 train still passes through it, allowing passengers the chance to gaze out of their windows and look at the latest works of art that have been left on the walls by the city's numerous graffiti artists. Everyone who enters the tunnel to paint the walls takes enormous risks by doing so, but we can't deny that some of their work is impressive. Very few people live in castles in the 21st century, which is a shame. Imagine how idyllic your life would be if you were able to buy and refurbish Menlo Castle in Galway, Ireland, with its beautiful scenery and riverside views. Your first job would probably be to get rid of the thick layers of vegetation that cling to its walls. But so long as it remains abandoned, we think the greenery is part of its charm. The castle was built in the 16th century as the home of the Blake family, who had it built in 1569 and passed it down from generation to generation until a large fire broke out in 1910, forcing the 20th century Blakes to move out of the place they'd called home for almost 3.5 centuries. The damage from the fire was never repaired, and it's been empty ever since. These days, the vegetation that clings to it is so dense that it's almost become a form of camouflage, making it hard to pick out the castle from its surroundings when viewed from a distance. After such a long time, the vines might be the only thing holding it together. Moving across Ireland to Cashel, we find the unfortunately named Hoare Abbey, which is a ruined medieval monastery. Despite what it sounds like, the abbey was named after the trees that surround it. The Gaelic word for yew tree is huar, which sounds a little like whore when pronounced with an English tongue. Hoare Abbey was founded in 1266 by the Benedictine order, but then given to Cistercian monks in 1272 by David McCarville, the Archbishop of Cashel, after he had a dream that the Benedictines were about to turn against him. At the center of the ruins, you'll find a tower, which was added during the 15th century as the monks took on more land and grew in number. Beyond that, the reasons that the abbey became abandoned have become lost to history. Records tell us that the title was dissolved in 1540 and transferred to the 9th Earl of Ormond, and that the lands were then granted to Sir Henry Radcliffe by Queen Elizabeth I in 1561. But we have no idea what, if anything, Radcliffe did with his new property. For all anybody knows, it's been abandoned ever since then. During the 1950s and 1960s, the rulers of Western countries were terrified of the prospect of a nuclear war breaking out with Russia. Armed conflict seemed to be inevitable during the lowest points of the Cold War, and so precautions had to be taken. If it became necessary to move the British royal family to a safe facility to avoid the consequences of a nuclear war, they would have been taken to Barnton Quarry nuclear bunker in Edinburgh, Scotland. The bunker, which runs beneath Corstorphine Hill, was built in 1952 as a place to keep the Queen, her family, and the senior members of her government safe in the worst of all events. There was even a space provided for the BBC, so the news could continue to be broadcast. We're sure that would have been a great comfort to the general population, left to fend for themselves without enormous bunkers to hole up in. Thankfully, no nuclear attack has ever been launched on the United Kingdom, and so the bunker has never been used. Its existence remained a state secret until 1963, when it was exposed to the public by a mysterious campaign group known as Spies for Peace. The bunker has been in private hands since 2005 and may one day be open to the public as a museum. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching and see you soon!